Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance (ESG). This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, Joan Feldbaum-Vidra, a managing director on KBRA's Sovereigns team, interviews Representative Jake Auchincloss. Representative Auchincloss is a Democrat from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District and is currently serving his first term in Congress. He is the Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Committee and a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. His focus areas include infrastructure, housing, the life sciences, and energy policy. Joan and Congressman Auchincloss discuss the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in November, and also talk about the future of the Build Back Better plan.
Hi, Congressman, and thank you so much for joining us. Could you speak a little bit about the process of passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in the House, also known as the IIJA, and we'll be referring to it as such in this podcast? And why is the infrastructure bill such an important piece of legislation? If you could help us understand this and frame this a bit for us, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
It's good to be on. I appreciate you having me. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I'll just call the infrastructure bill going forward, is a roughly $1 trillion investment in the nation's hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, transit, high-speed internet, et cetera. And it is a bipartisan effort. So it first started in the House of Representatives, where we on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee passed the INVEST Act. The INVEST Act passed the full House, and the INVEST Act was a bigger, more ambitious series of investments in our nation's infrastructure. That bill did not have legs in the Senate, and so the president and a bipartisan group of senators, really over the course of two different iterations, negotiated what became this bipartisan infrastructure deal, which took elements of the INVEST Act and also took some Republican components to get to 60 votes in the Senate and then passage in the House in November. It's really, along with the American Rescue Plan, which cut childhood poverty by up to 40%, the hallmark achievement, I think, of the president's first year in office. And let me give you a sense for why this bill is so exciting. And I'm just going to give you some large buckets here. This is the largest federal investment in public transit ever. This is the largest federal investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak. This is the biggest investment in the structural integrity of bridges since the Eisenhower interstate system of the 1950s. This is the largest investment in clean drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in history. This is going to guarantee clean water for millions of families. This is going to ensure that every American has access to high-speed internet. And this is going to make substantial investments in clean energy technology and infrastructure. So this bill is not just about getting up to the 21st century, repairing what has been overlooked and broken. It's also about making investments in our future competitiveness and productivity for the decades ahead.
Thank you for that explanation. Really, really interesting, kind of important context. Could you share with us some specific highlights of the IIJA?
Sure. So as I highlighted, there are a number of different imperatives here. I'll go into a few of the different buckets, and I'll talk about it in the context of my home state, Massachusetts, which people can extrapolate across all 50 different states. So just to give you a sense of it, in Massachusetts, we've got very old subsurface water infrastructure, for example. We were some of the first people to build out underground pipes for drinking water and sewer. And the cost of being a pioneer is that your infrastructure gets older faster. So we've got billions of dollars of subsurface water liabilities. This bill will send $1 billion to Massachusetts alone to upgrade our clean water and our wastewater infrastructure. That is transformative. This bill is going to ensure that every Bay State resident has access to high-speed internet. That's really the electricity of the 21st century. And then finally, this bill is going to upgrade thousands of bridges across the country. The single most popular provision of the infrastructure bill is ensuring the safety and soundness of our nation's bridges. And that's really been a long overdue maintenance criterion, one that has been underfunded for decades now. And both through state formula funding and through direct grants, we are going to fix a lot of bridges in this country.
Thank you for all of that focused information on Massachusetts. It's very, very ambitious, clearly. Furthering on that, what are the environmental and social provisions specifically included in the IIJA?
Yeah, I want to call out one in particular that I think is getting overlooked, and that is the investment in battery technology as well as our electrical grid. A lot of focus is rightfully on renewable energy sources, right? Offshore wind, which is particularly important in Massachusetts, geothermal, nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, solar, of course. And we've got to make progress on all these fronts. Less attention is paid, I think, into the complement to these generative technologies, and that is the storage technologies. We cannot make transformative progress on renewable energy without concomitant transformative progress on batteries and on electrical grid resilience. And the reason is that with renewables, you've got to be able to store energy. And you really can store energy in two different ways. You can store it across space, meaning if there is a peak of energy production on the offshore of Massachusetts because it's very windy, meanwhile, there's a peak of energy demand in the Midwest because it's really hot and people are turning their air conditioners on, you've got to be able to match that peak energy production offshore with the peak energy consumption in the Midwest. And right now, our grid can't really do that very effectively. We don't have a national grid. We've got a patchwork of state grids. And so by spending tens of millions of dollars knitting together and making more resilient our electrical grid, we are able to match peaks with troughs across the country. So that's one way that we're storing energy. We're storing it across space. The other, of course, is to store energy across time. And that's a battery. That's what a battery does. We need to see orders of magnitude improvements in our battery technology, which we have been seeing over the last decade. I think an underappreciated source of optimism for climate change is the fact that lithium-ion batteries have just gotten a lot better in the last 10 years. And that's an incredibly important part of everything from electric vehicle charging stations and electric cars to more significant physical plant. We are also making a lot of investments in R&D for battery technology. And so we're going to upgrade our grid and our batteries so that we can store energy across space and time and really turbocharge renewable energy development.
Terrific points. And related to those insights, what is the interplay between the federal government and the local government in allocating the funding for IIJA?
This, to me, is actually one of my key focuses for 2022. And for listeners who are wondering, where's the action at, right? Like, okay, Congress has passed the bill, the money hasn't started flowing yet. Like, where's the action if I've got a priority and I want to see it funded and prioritized? My answer to that is the action is at the nexus of federal, state, and local. So what I mean by that is the federal government is dispersing these funds in two different ways. One is through formula funding to the states. It goes to state departments of transportation, for example, and says, based on your population and a number of other considerations, you get X dollars for transportation stuff. It's also doing direct grant programs to municipalities or to special interest issues, like, for example, a regional consortium for water infrastructure that is not defined by municipal boundaries, but defined by a shared special interest in water infrastructure. And so there's a lot of different stakeholder engagement here. There is the federal delegation of a state that can help navigate Washington and explain the Byzantine rules and regulations about how grants and formula funding works. There are the state reps and state senators who are advocating at the state level for how the funds will actually be designated by their departments of transportation. There are the local officials and local activists and local civil society organizations who are the ones surfacing their priorities and presenting an aligned interest so that the state senators and the congressmen can all row in the same direction. And there's no rule book for this. This is where relationships, this is where understanding government becomes so critical. And this is really going to be the focus of 2022 for my team and me, is let's figure out the priorities of the district. And indeed, we already have a pretty strong list of those. And now let's go fight for every last dollar and cent for the district, working with state and local stakeholders as well as other interested groups.
Let's pivot a bit to the Build Back Better plan. Though the infrastructure bill has a historic level of climate funding, the Build Back Better plan, which has been passed by the House but not by the Senate, targets climate mitigation more specifically. Do you think it's likely that the BBB plan will be passed through the Senate?
Well, Build Back Better in its current form is not going to be passed in the Senate. I think Senator Manchin has been very clear about that. There are big elements of it that could be. Universal pre-kindergarten, for example, has support from not just Senator Manchin, but indeed some Republicans. The prescription drug pricing plan is broadly popular and could be passed standalone. And then there are the climate provisions, which, although narrowed under Senator Manchin's direction, for example, we removed the Clean Electricity Payment Program, which was an important carrot and stick program to induce state utilities to transition to renewables, is still the largest investment in climate action in history and is largely a standalone measure. It's funded. It is not all that controversial anymore with centrist Democrats, and could be the cornerstone of a new Build Back Better Act that could meet with Senator Manchin's approval.
And what are some of the highlights of the climate mitigation funding and social programs included in the BBB plan?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in there. There's $20 billion, for example, to design projects that reduce or avoid emissions. There's $5 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's significant funding for clean energy, basic research, and translational development. There's weatherization programs. The Build Back Better Act's climate components are, as I said, really the boldest government action on climate change in history. Probably the most important element of it are the tax credits for clean energy investment. They're really sort of a cousin to carbon pricing, which remains probably the most compelling market-based inducement to a transition to a clean energy economy, but it's very challenging to pass carbon pricing in the Congress because really the Republicans are squarely opposed to it. Tax credits are sort of a cousin to that approach.
And on the provision in BBB that targets expanding affordable housing access, can you speak a little bit about that provision and why housing is such an important cause for you?
I represent a socioeconomically diverse district, the suburbs of Boston through the suburbs of Providence, Rhode Island. And there are a range of interests that I hear that are localized or specialized in one way or the other. But a very common thread is the cost of housing. Here in Massachusetts, most people are spending 40, 50% of their disposable income on housing costs. That's above the 30% that Department of Housing and Urban Development defines as being cost burden by housing. So housing is just eating up a lot of people's wallets. And broadly speaking, there's two ways that you can tackle that problem: supply and demand. One, we have got to build more housing. We have to build more housing. Largely, that means states and cities need to liberalize their zoning laws, that single family can become multifamily so that you can add accessory dwelling units, so that it's just less cumbersome and less uncertain for people to add density, especially near transit. Then there's also the demand side. We have got to help first-time homeowners and renters who are cost burdened and who need some assistance to access the housing stock that exists, because otherwise they're going to be locked out of jobs and services. The Build Back Better Act really does both. It really tackles both the supply and the demand side in different ways. I'll call out one other feature of this that I think is particularly important, in that the Build Back Better Act also makes generational investments in our public housing stock, which has really been overlooked and underfunded for as long as it's been in existence, since mid-century. This upgrades the basic shelter of the denizens of public housing in America to include ensuring they are accessing unleaded water, that they have fire safety provisions, that their basic HVAC works, really things that are just core to the dignity of those who live in public housing.
I think that wraps it up. That was excellent.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you to Representative Auchincloss and Joan for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our ratings and research.